198 3/4, wearing black trunks, the famous Detroit Brown Bomber, world's heavyweight champion, Joe Louis.
They told him to never smile in the ring, never celebrate, never be photographed with white women, never let white America see anything but humble, disciplined, controlled, a black champion who knew his place, the acceptable Negro, the anti-Jack Johnson, the brown bomber who would follow all the rules. And he did. Until the summer of 1936, when a German fighter named Max Schmeling knocked him onto the canvas in front of 60,000 people, and Adolf Hitler claimed it as proof of Aryan superiority. But 2 years later, Joe Louis would get 124 seconds of redemption. 124 seconds that would unite a nation, strike a blow against fascism, and prove that excellence has no color. By the time those seconds ended, Schmeling would be in the hospital. Hitler would forbid German newspapers from reporting the truth, and Joe Louis would become more than a boxer. He'd become a symbol of democracy itself. This is the story of how he got there. How a sharecropper's son from Alabama rose to become the most important athlete of his generation. How he lost everything and won it back. How 2 fights became symbolic warfare between nations and ideologies. But first, you need to understand where he came from. May 13th, 1914, Lafayette, Alabama. A sharecropper's cabin with dirt floors and walls thin enough to feel the wind through them. Monroe and Lily Barrow welcomed their 7th child into a world designed to keep him trapped. They named him Joseph Louis Barrow. This was the Deep South during Jim Crow. Lynchings were common. Black families lived in perpetual poverty, working land they'd never own, accumulating debt they could never repay. The system wasn't designed to let you escape. It was designed to crush you. When Joseph was 2 years old, his father suffered a complete mental breakdown. The poverty, the hopelessness, the endless grinding despair broke something inside Monroe Barrow. He was committed to the Searcy Hospital for the Negro Insane. Joseph would never know him. Lily was left alone with 8 children. She did laundry for white families, took in ironing, cleaned houses, worked dawn to dusk with hands raw from lye soap. The children helped however they could. It was survival, nothing more. In 1920, Lily married Patrick Brooks, a widower with his own children. The combined family was massive and struggling. They needed more than Alabama could offer. Lily had heard the stories about the North, the Great Migration, black families fleeing to Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. Cities with real jobs, real money, real schools. In 1926, when Joseph was 12, they made the decision. They sold what little they had, boarded a segregated train, and headed to Detroit. The train ride was an education in itself. The colored car, the separate bathrooms, the way white passengers looked through them as if they didn't exist. But they were heading north, heading toward possibility. Detroit hit them like a physical force. Buildings scraping the sky, electric lights everywhere, cars, factories, the smell of industry and opportunity. The city was booming. Ford's assembly lines, auto plants, steel mills, real jobs with real wages. The family crammed into a small apartment on Macomb Street in Black Bottom, a neighborhood where other Southern migrants had settled. The North wasn't paradise. It was segregated too, just more subtly. But it was different. Better. There was room to breathe. Joseph enrolled at Duffield Elementary School. Real classrooms, real books, real teachers. He was quiet, self-conscious about his Alabama accent and his patched clothes. He struggled with reading and math, but his mother insisted education mattered. At home, the family worked constantly. Patrick Brooks got a job at Ford. Brutal assembly line work, but better than sharecropping. Lily took in laundry. The kids worked whatever jobs they could find. Money was always tight. By 16, Joseph had dropped out of school. Not because he wanted to, but because the family needed money more than another diploma. He got a job delivering ice. 50-pound blocks hauled up multiple flights of stairs all day. Back-breaking work that paid just enough to help with rent and food. This was his life now. Trading cotton fields for ice blocks. Trading Alabama poverty for Detroit's struggle. His mother watched him come home exhausted every night, hands cracked and bleeding from the cold. She saw the light dimming in his eyes, the same light she'd seen dim in so many black men crushed by reality. She wanted something more for him, something better. So she gave him money for violin lessons. Music could be his way out, could develop discipline and culture, could open doors that manual labor never would. Joseph took the money, thanked his mother, and walked straight to Brewster's East Side Gymnasium. Because he discovered something his mother didn't know about. Something he'd been doing in secret for months. Boxing. Brewster's gym was a converted recreation center. A ring, some bags, worn equipment, the smell of sweat and dreams. Young men, mostly black, mostly poor, all looking for the same thing. A way out. A path to something better. Boxing wasn't respectable. It was violent and dangerous. But it was also the one sport where a black man could compete fairly. Where skin color mattered less than skill. Where if you were good enough, you could make real money and escape poverty through your own fists. Joseph had been sneaking into the gym after work for months, learning the basics, sparring, getting hit and hitting back. He wasn't a natural, wasn't particularly big or strong, but he had something that caught the trainer's attention. Dedication, focus, an almost robotic calm, and power. Unexpected power in his punches. A trainer named Holman Williams took him under his wing, taught him proper stance, combinations, movement, how to read an opponent, how to take a punch and keep coming. Joseph absorbed everything, practiced religiously, days delivering ice, evenings at the gym, nights dreaming of something bigger. His mother eventually found out, was furious. This wasn't what the violin money was for. But Joseph promised her, promised he'd be careful, promised he'd make something of himself. And she saw something in his eyes when he talked about boxing. Purpose, direction. She didn't approve, but she didn't stop him. Joseph started fighting amateur bouts, small local shows. No money, just experience. He won some, lost some, learned from both. Got better, faster, smarter. The losses hurt, but they taught him, showed him weaknesses to fix. He started winning more consistently. In 1933, at 19, he entered the Detroit Golden Gloves, the amateur championship where careers began or ended. Joseph fought his way through, won his division, won regionals. In 1934, won the National Golden Gloves Championship in the light heavyweight division. At 20 years old, Joseph Louis Barrow was the national amateur champion. 50 fights, 43 wins, 7 losses that had taught him humility and hunger. Suddenly people were paying attention. This quiet kid from Alabama, calm, controlled, hits like a truck. In 1934, Joseph made a decision that would change everything. He would turn professional, would enter the brutal world of professional boxing, would see if he could survive in a sport where black fighters were often exploited and discarded. It wasn't an easy decision. Professional boxing meant being managed and controlled. It meant entering a world dominated by white promoters and white audiences who expected black fighters to entertain, but not dominate. The odds were against him. He was 20 years old, barely educated, poor, black in a country that treated black men as inferior. But he had his fists, his speed, his power, his calm, and he was about to meet 2 men who would see in him something more than just a fighter. 2 men who would see possibility, who would see maybe, just maybe, the first black heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson that white America might actually accept. The first black champion who could play by their rules long enough to change those rules forever. Joseph Louis Barrow was about to become Joe Louis, the brown bomber, the most important athlete of his generation, and the world was about to discover what that meant. In 1934, Two men walked into Brewster's gymnasium looking for Joseph Louis Barrow, John Roxborough and Julian Black, both successful black businessmen, both well-connected in Detroit's underground economy, both looking for a fighter they could transform into something unprecedented, a black heavyweight champion that white America would accept. They'd been watching Joseph fight in the amateur ranks, saw the power, the calm, the potential, but more importantly, they saw the opportunity. Jack Johnson had been the first black heavyweight champion, holding the title from 1908 to 1915. And white America had never forgiven him for it. Johnson had been everything they feared: flamboyant, confident, married to white women, refused to play the role of humble Negro, lived large and made sure everyone knew it. White America hated him for it. Spent years searching for a great white hope to beat him, eventually convicted him on trumped-up charges under the Mann Act and drove him into exile. The lesson was clear. A black champion who didn't know his place would be destroyed. Roxborough and Black understood this. They'd studied Johnson's career, understood why he'd been successful in the ring, but a disaster outside it. They believed they could build a different kind of black champion, one who was just as dominant, but infinitely more acceptable, one who followed a specific set of rules designed to make white America comfortable. They pitched this to Joseph, told him they could make him champion, could make him wealthy, could make him famous, but there would be rules. Non-negotiable rules. Rules that would strip away personality and spontaneity and replace them with careful control. Joseph listened. 20 years old, broke, ambitious. He understood what they were offering. A path to something he'd only dreamed about. And he understood the price. He agreed. The rules were explicit, written down, drilled into him from day one. Never smile in the ring. Never celebrate victories. Never gloat over defeated opponents. A fighter could be devastating, but he had to be emotionless about it. Clinical, professional, no showboating, no personality, just efficient violence. Never be photographed with white women. Never even be seen in public with white women. This was perhaps the most important rule. Johnson had married white women, and white America never forgave him. Joseph would have to be careful about every public appearance, every photograph, every moment that could be captured and used against him. Never go to nightclubs alone. Never be seen partying publicly. No drinking in public. No wild behavior. The image had to be controlled, disciplined, respectable. A fighter who went home after fights, who didn't carouse, who represented dignity. Always be humble. In interviews, in public appearances, always deflect praise. Always credit others. Never claim superiority. Never predict victories. Just express hope to do his best and let the results speak for themselves. Always show respect to opponents, before fights and after. No trash talk. No psychological warfare. Just professional respect and then domination in the ring. These weren't suggestions. They were requirements. The price of being managed by Roxborough and Black. The price of having a shot at the championship. The price of being a black fighter in 1934 America. Joseph accepted them all, became Joe Louis, dropped Barrow for simplicity, shorter, more memorable, more marketable. The anti-Jack Johnson. His professional debut was July 4th, 1934, at Bacon's Arena in Chicago. Opponent, Jack Kraken. The fight lasted 1 round. Louis knocked him out with clinical efficiency. 52 seconds. No smile, no celebration, just professional violence. The pattern was established. In his first year as a professional, Joe Louis fought 14 times, won all 14, 12 by knockout. He wasn't just winning, he was destroying opponents with machine-like precision. Calm, controlled, devastating. The boxing world took notice. This wasn't just another fighter. This was something different, something special. A black fighter who hit like a truck, but presented himself with perfect respectability. Who gave reporters nothing controversial to write about. Who made white audiences comfortable even as he knocked their fighters unconscious. By 1935, Lewis was fighting bigger names, better opponents. The wins kept coming. The knockouts piled up, and then came the fight that would make him a national sensation. June 25th, 1935. Yankee Stadium, New York. Joe Louis versus Primo Carnera, the former heavyweight champion, 6'6", 260 pounds, massive Italian fighter backed by the mob. More than that, Carnera was white. This was the kind of matchup that drew massive audiences, that stirred racial tensions, that mattered beyond just boxing. 60,000 people packed Yankee Stadium. They came to see if the young black fighter could handle a former champion, could handle a giant, could handle the pressure of the big stage. Louis knocked Carnera out in the 6th round, didn't just beat him, destroyed him, made the former champion look helpless, made him look ordinary. The victory sent shockwaves through boxing, through Black America, through the entire country. Joe Louis wasn't just good, he was potentially great, and he was doing it while following all the rules. Being humble, being respectful, being everything Jack Johnson wasn't. Black America was electrified. Here was a champion in the making, someone who could represent them on the world stage, someone who could show that black excellence was undeniable, someone who could make them proud. White America was more complicated. Some loved Louis because he was humble and respectful, never threatening. Others feared him for the same reason they'd feared Johnson. Not because of who he was, but what he represented. A black man dominating white men, being celebrated for it. But Louis kept winning, kept following the rules, kept being perfect. 6 weeks after demolishing Carnera, Louis fought Max Baer, another former heavyweight champion. September 24th, 1935, Yankee Stadium again, 88,000 people. Bigger crowd than Carnera, bigger stakes. Baer was a powerful puncher, a legitimate threat, a fighter who'd killed a man in the ring years before. Louis knocked him out in the 4th round, dominated him, made it look easy. 2 former champions destroyed in less than 3 months. Joe Louis was 21 years old, 22 wins, 0 losses, 21 knockouts. In just over a year as a professional, he'd become the most feared fighter in boxing, the biggest box office draw in the world. Newspapers called him the perfect fighter, called him the Brown Bomber. He was more than a fighter now. He was a phenomenon. Black America embraced him as their hero. White America cautiously accepted him because he followed the rules. Never smiled, never celebrated, never threatened their comfort. By early 1936, Louis's record stood at 27-0, 27 wins, 23 knockouts. He'd destroyed everyone they put in front of him. Former champions, legitimate contenders, everyone. There was talk of a title fight, talk of Louis facing James J. Braddock, the current heavyweight champion, talk of making history, the first black heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson, the first in 21 years. But first, there was another fight, a fight that seemed routine, a fight against a former champion past his prime, a fighter most people expected Louis to demolish. Max Schmeling, German fighter, former world champion from 1930 to 1932, lost the title 4 years ago. Hadn't been particularly impressive since. Most people saw him as a stepping stone, an easy opponent for Louis on the way to a title shot, a name on the resume, nothing more. Louis was made a 10-1 favorite. The odds weren't just about skill, they were about inevitability. Louis was young, strong, undefeated. Schmeling was older, past his prime, already beaten. The outcome seemed predetermined. Louis would win, probably by knockout, probably early. Then, he'd fight Braddock for the championship, make history, become champion. But Max Schmeling had spent weeks studying film of Joe Louis's fights, had noticed something, a weakness, a tiny flaw in Louis's defense that no one else had spotted. Louis dropped his left hand after throwing a jab, just for a split second, left himself open to a right cross. It was subtle, something most fighters wouldn't notice, something most wouldn't be able to exploit even if they saw it. But Schmeling had seen it, had built an entire fight strategy around it, and he told the press he would knock out Joe Louis. Nobody believed him. The fight was scheduled for June 19th, 1936. Yankee Stadium, Louis versus Schmeling, the undefeated young champion in the making against the aging former title holder. Louis was 27-0, unstoppable, invincible, the future of boxing. He'd followed all the rules, done everything right, been perfect. And he was about to learn something that would haunt him for 2 years. Perfection is fragile. Reputation is temporary. And sometimes, no matter how careful you are, no matter how many rules you follow, the world can knock you down in ways you never saw coming. Max Schmeling was waiting, and he knew exactly where to throw the punch that would change everything. Max Schmeling was not supposed to be a problem. By every measure, every calculation, every reasonable assessment, he was past his prime. 30 years old in a sport where most fighters peaked in their mid-20s. A former heavyweight champion, yes, but that championship reign had ended 4 years ago in 1932. Since then, nothing particularly impressive. A few wins against mediocre opposition. Nothing that suggested he could compete with the young, hungry, undefeated Joe Louis. But Max Schmeling had something more valuable than youth or recent victories. He had experience, intelligence, and an almost obsessive attention to detail that would prove to be Joe Louis's undoing. Maximilian Adolf Otto Siegfried Schmeling was born in 1905 in Brandenburg, Germany. Started boxing as a teenager. Rose through the ranks in the 1920s with a combination of technical skill and devastating power. Won the heavyweight championship in 1930 under controversial circumstances, became the first German to hold the title, and defended it twice before losing to Max Baer in 1933. By 1936, most boxing experts considered Schmeling yesterday's news. He'd been champion, had his moment. But that moment had passed. This fight against Joe Louis was supposed to be a payday, a name opponent for Louis to demolish on his way to a title shot. Nothing more. What nobody understood was that Schmeling had been preparing for this fight in ways Louis and his team couldn't imagine. For months, Schmeling had been studying film of Louis's fights, not casually watching, studying, analyzing frame by frame, watching the same fights dozens of times, taking notes, looking for patterns, looking for weaknesses. The film study was meticulous. Schmeling would watch a fight multiple times at normal speed to get the overall sense of Louis's style. Then he'd watch in slow motion, studying specific sequences, how Louis moved, how he set up combinations, how he defended, what he did after throwing certain punches. And that's when Schmeling saw it. A tiny flaw, a split-second vulnerability that appeared again and again. After Joe Louis threw his jab, his left hand would drop slightly as he brought it back to guard position. Just for a moment. Just long enough for an experienced fighter with good timing to counter with a right cross over the top. It was subtle, easy to miss at full speed. Louis's trainers hadn't noticed it. His previous opponents hadn't exploited it. But Schmeling saw it, and he understood that this tiny technical flaw could be the key to beating the supposedly unbeatable fighter. Schmeling built his entire fight strategy around this one weakness. He wouldn't try to outbox Louis or trade power punches. He would be patient. Wait for Louis to jab. Watch for that dropped left hand. Counter with the right cross. Do it again and again until Louis couldn't take it anymore. When Schmeling told reporters he would knock out Joe Louis, they literally laughed. The German fighter passed his prime, claiming he'd beat the 27-0 Brown Bomber who destroyed former champions Primo Carnera and Max Baer. It seemed delusional, the desperate boast of a fighter who knew he was about to be humiliated. The odds makers made Louis a 10-1 favorite. Some bookies offered even longer odds. The betting wasn't about whether Louis would win, but how quickly he'd finish Schmeling. First round? Second? Third at the latest? Joe Louis himself was overconfident, not in an arrogant, boastful way. That wasn't his style, but in a deeper, more dangerous way. He was already thinking past Schmeling to the championship fight against James J. Braddock that would follow. Already imagining himself as champion. Already planning the future. His training camp reflected this complacency. Louis trained, of course, stayed in shape, went through the motions, but the intensity wasn't there. The focus wasn't complete. He was preparing for Schmeling the way you'd prepare for a sparring session, not like you'd prepare for a war. His trainers noticed but didn't push too hard. They believed the hype too. Louis was too fast, too powerful, too young for an aging former champion. Why kill yourself in training camp for an opponent who didn't stand a chance? But there was another dimension to this fight that would grow more significant with each passing month. Max Schmeling was German, and Germany in 1936 was transforming into something dark and dangerous. Adolf Hitler had been chancellor since January 1933. 3 years of consolidating absolute power. 3 years of Nazi ideology spreading through every aspect of German society. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 had stripped Jews of citizenship and basic rights. Hitler's rhetoric about racial superiority, about Aryan supremacy, about the inferiority of non-white races was becoming more explicit, more vicious, more central to the Nazi vision of the world. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were scheduled for August, just 2 months after the Louis Schmeling fight. Hitler planned to use them as a massive propaganda showcase, proof of Aryan superiority, demonstration that his racial theories were scientific fact. And Max Schmeling, whether he wanted it or not, was being positioned as a symbol of these theories. The German sports press, controlled by the Nazi propaganda machine, framed the upcoming fight in explicitly racial terms. This wasn't just boxing. This was a test. The Aryan fighter against the Black American. Superior race against inferior race. Schmeling himself was uncomfortable with this. He wasn't a Nazi Party member, didn't share Hitler's ideology, personally got along fine with Joe Louis, respected him as a fighter. But in Nazi Germany, you didn't get to separate yourself from the state. Your victories belonged to the Führer. Your success proved the ideology. Your failures reflected on the entire nation and race. When Schmeling won and the Nazi propaganda assumed he would eventually, it would be celebrated as proof of everything Hitler preached. Proof that Aryans were superior. Proof that the Nazi vision was correct. Proof that race determined destiny. This context wasn't as explicit or understood in 1936 as it would become by 1938. The world didn't yet fully grasp how monstrous Nazi Germany would become. The concentration camps were just beginning. The worst atrocities were still years away, but the signs were there. The warnings. The sense that something was very wrong in Germany. The weigh-in took place on June 18th, the day before the fight, at the New York State Athletic Commission offices. Louis weighed 198 pounds, in excellent physical condition. Schmeling 192 pounds, lean and focused. Both fighters looked ready. Louis answered reporters' questions with his usual humble responses. Yes, he was confident. No, he wasn't overconfident. He respected Schmeling as a former champion, would do his best. Schmeling repeated his prediction. He would knock out Joe Louis. The reporters still thought it was funny. Some actually chuckled. The odds remained 10-1. Nothing Schmeling said could convince anyone he had a real chance. June 19th, 1936. Yankee Stadium, the Bronx, New York City, the biggest venue in American sports. 60,000 people packed every available seat. Lines stretched around the block with fans who couldn't get tickets. Thousands more gathered outside, hoping to hear updates, to feel part of the event even from a distance. The stadium buzzed with energy. This was New York. This was boxing. This was spectacle. Hot dogs and beer. Cigars and cigarettes. The smell of sweat and anticipation. Men in suits. Men in work clothes. Rich and poor. Black and white. All united in their certainty about what would happen. Joe Louis would destroy Max Schmeling. The only question was how quickly. For Black America, this fight meant everything. Joe Louis represented hope, pride, proof that excellence could transcend racism. Every Louis fight was more than sports. It was validation, evidence that they belonged at the highest levels, that they could compete and win. In Harlem, families and friends gathered around radios. In Detroit, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in every city with a significant black population, people were tuning in. Bars were packed. Churches had radios. Community centers filled with listeners. This was their champion, their hero, their proof. For white America, reactions were mixed. Some genuinely loved Lewis because he was humble and respectful, followed all the rules, never threatened their comfort, made them feel progressive for supporting him. Others were less enthusiastic, uncomfortable with a black fighter dominating white opponents, worried about what it represented, already hoping someone would beat him. But everyone expected Louis to win. The debate was about how, not whether. The atmosphere in Yankee Stadium as fight time approached was electric. Preliminary bouts finished. The ring was cleared. Spotlights blazed. 60,000 voices creating a roar that could be heard for blocks. Millions more were listening on radio. This was network broadcasting at its peak. NBC carrying the fight coast to coast. Announcers describing every detail for audiences who couldn't see. The technology was still relatively new. Radio had only become mainstream in the previous decade, but already it was transforming how Americans experienced major events. Joe Louis entered the ring first, walking through the crowd with his trainers, calm, expressionless, following the rules even now. No showboating, no playing to the crowd, just professional focus. He climbed through the ropes, wore his signature white trunks, bounced lightly on his feet. Ready. The crowd roared. Their champion, their bomber, the man who would make history. Max Schmeling entered moments later, more serious than Louis, older. You could see the age in his face, the miles on his body, but also determination, focus. He knew something they didn't, had a plan they couldn't imagine. The applause for Schmeling was polite, respectful, nothing like the roar for Louis. These people hadn't come to see Schmeling. They'd come to see Lewis demolish him. The referee, Arthur Donovan, called both fighters to the center of the ring. Final instructions. The words every referee says before every fight. Protect yourself at all times. Break when I say break. Touch gloves and come out fighting. Louis and Schmeling touched gloves. A brief moment of sportsmanship before the violence. Returned to their corners. Trainers giving final advice. Water. Vaseline on the face. Mouthpieces in. All the rituals. The ring announcer's voice boomed across the stadium, introducing the fighters. Max Schmeling, 192 pounds, from Germany. Polite applause. Joe Louis, 198 pounds, from Detroit, Michigan. The roar was deafening. 60,000 people losing their minds. And then the bell rang. Round one began. Louis came forward immediately with his typical style. Calm, measured, controlled, throwing jabs to establish the range. Long, straight punches designed to keep Schmeling at distance. Schmeling circled to his right. Patient, defensive, not engaging yet. Just watching, studying. Louis pressed forward. More jabs, testing Schmeling's defense, looking for openings, but not rushing, taking his time. The round was mostly Louis jabbing and Schmeling circling. No big exchanges, no drama. Just feeling each other out. The round ended. Both fighters returned to their corners. Louis looked comfortable, confident. This was going according to plan. Schmeling looked focused, waiting. Round two was similar. Louis continued advancing, throwing more jabs, some right hands, starting to land more cleanly. Schmeling defended well, but wasn't doing much offensively. The crowd started getting restless. They'd come to see action, to see Louis knock someone out. This was taking too long, but Louis wasn't worried. He knew how fights worked. Sometimes you had to break an opponent down slowly. Schmeling was tough, had been champion, knew how to survive. It would take time. Round three. Louis pressing forward more aggressively now, throwing combinations. Jab, jab, right hand, jab, left hook. Schmeling was defending, but getting hit more. The crowd sensed the knockout was coming, started getting louder, anticipating the finish. Louis landed a solid right hand that snapped Schmeling's head back. The crowd roared. Another combination. Schmeling was against the ropes. Lewis fired multiple punches, but Schmeling covered up, survived. The round ended, 3 rounds complete. Lewis winning every round, landing more punches, looking dominant, but Schmeling still standing, still focused, still executing his plan, because Max Schmeling was watching, studying Louis in real time, confirming what he'd seen on film. That dropped left hand after the jab. He'd seen it multiple times already, was timing it, measuring the distance, waiting for the perfect moment. The moment was coming. Round 4. And when it arrived, everything would change. Round 4. 2 minutes and 30 seconds into the round, it happened. Joe Louis threw a jab, sharp and quick and powerful. The same jab he'd thrown thousands of times in training, in fights. The jab that had been so effective against every opponent. The punch landed clean on Schmeling's face. And as Louis brought his left hand back to guard position for just a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, the hand dropped. Max Schmeling had been waiting for this exact moment, had trained for it, prepared for it, seen it on film dozens of times. And now, in real time, in the 4th round of the fight, it appeared. Schmeling fired his right hand, a perfect cross thrown over the dropped left. The punch traveled maybe 8 inches, caught Joe Louis flush on the left side of his jaw. The impact was clean, solid, devastating. Louis's eyes widened, his body stiffened, something he'd never felt before. Real pain, real danger. His legs wobbled slightly. The crowd, which had been roaring constantly, suddenly went quiet. 60,000 people collectively gasping. What just happened? Louis tried to cover up, tried to regain his composure, but Schmeling didn't give him time, pressed forward immediately, threw another right hand, and another. Every time Louis jabbed, Schmeling was there with the counter, right hand over the dropped left, again and again. It was scientific, calculated, devastating. Schmeling had found the weakness and was exploiting it mercilessly. By the end of round 4, Louis's face showed the damage. His left eye was starting to swell, the skin around it discolored. He'd been hurt multiple times. The invincible fighter, the undefeated brown bomber, the man who was supposed to become heavyweight champion, was in real trouble. In Louis's corner between rounds, his trainers were panicking. Jack Blackburn, his chief trainer, tried to adjust. Keep your left hand up. Watch for that right hand. Move your head. But Louis was hurt, tired, confused. Habits are hard to break in the moment, especially when you're taking punishment. Schmeling's corner was calm, confident. The plan was working. Keep doing what you're doing. Wait for the jab. Counter with the right. Be patient. The knockout will come. Round 5. Schmeling continued landing that right hand, over and over. Louis tried to adjust his defense, tried to keep his left hand up, but old habits reasserted themselves, and Schmeling was reading him perfectly now. Could anticipate when the jab was coming. Could time the counter almost before Louis threw the punch. Louis's left eye was swelling shut. His face was marked up. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He was taking systematic punishment. The crowd, which had been so loud and confident at the start, was now mostly silent, shocked. This wasn't supposed to happen. Round 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. A systematic breakdown. Schmeling landing that right hand almost at will. Louis trying to fight back, throwing combinations, landing some good punches. He was still dangerous, still capable of ending the fight with one big punch. But Schmeling was boxing intelligently, using movement, picking his spots, and always coming back with that right hand over the dropped left. Louis's face was a mess, both eyes swollen, cuts above and below, his mouth bleeding. His body language showed the damage. The confident fighter from the early rounds was gone, replaced by someone hurt, tired, desperate. The crowd was in shock. Many were silent. Some were leaving. They couldn't watch their hero being beaten, being humiliated. This was wrong. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. In black neighborhoods across America, Families gathered around radios were experiencing collective trauma. Every punch Schmeling landed felt personal. Every time Louis stumbled, their hearts broke a little more. This was more than a fight. This was their champion, their hope, their proof, and he was losing. Round 12. Louis came out for the final round exhausted, hurt, but still fighting, still trying. His corner had told him he needed a knockout to win. The judges were scoring it for Schmeling. The only way Louis could win now was to knock Schmeling out. Louis tried, pressed forward, threw combinations, but his punches lacked snap. He was too tired, too hurt. Schmeling defended, circled, waited. 2 minutes into round 12, Schmeling saw his opening. Louis threw a desperate right hand, missed, was off balance. Schmeling stepped in and fired his right hand one more time, caught Louis perfectly on the jaw. Joe Louis went down, fell to the canvas for the first time in his professional career. The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in shock, disbelief, horror. Louis was on his hands and knees. The referee, Arthur Donovan, began counting. 1, 2, 3. Louis tried to get up, grabbed the ropes. His legs weren't working right. Everything was fuzzy. The stadium seemed to spin. 4, 5, 6. He made it to his knees, looked up at the referee, his eyes unfocused. Glassy. 7, 8. He tried to stand. Pulled on the ropes, got one leg under him, but the other leg wouldn't cooperate. He fell back to one knee. 9. Louis was on his hands and knees again. Tried one more time to rise. Couldn't. The strength wasn't there. The legs wouldn't work. 10. The referee waved his arms. Fight over. Technical knockout. Stopped. Max Schmeling had knocked out Joe Louis. The silence in Yankee Stadium was complete. 60,000 people unable to process what they'd just witnessed. The unbeatable fighter had been beaten. The perfect record was broken. Joe Louis, who was supposed to become the next heavyweight champion, was on the canvas, defeated. The radio announcer struggled to find words. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't possible. But it had happened. Max Schmeling, the 10-1 underdog, the washed-up former champion, had knocked out Joe Louis. In the ring, Louis sat on the canvas. Trainers and doctors rushed to him. He was conscious, but hurt badly, physically and emotionally. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the shame in his heart, the sense of failure, of letting everyone down. He'd been so confident, so certain, and he'd been destroyed, demolished, made to look ordinary in front of the world. Schmeling stood in the neutral corner, professional even in victory, not celebrating excessively, not gloating, just satisfaction at executing his plan perfectly. He'd seen the weakness, exploited it, won the fight. That was enough. The crowd slowly began filing out, many in tears, many in shock. They'd come to see their hero triumph. Instead, they'd witnessed his humiliation. The walk to the subway, the drive home, all of it felt surreal, impossible. For Black America, the loss was devastating beyond measure. In Harlem, people who'd gathered around radios for celebration instead wept. Grown men crying openly, women holding each other, children confused about why the adults were so upset. In Detroit, families sat in silence, unable to speak, unable to process. Their Joe, their champion, their proof, knocked out, beaten. Across the country, in every city with a significant Black population, the reaction was the same: grief, shock, despair. This was more than a boxing match. Joe Louis had represented hope, pride, proof that Black excellence was undeniable. And he'd lost. All the racist whispers came rushing back. The doubts about Black fighters, about whether they could handle pressure, about whether they had the heart, about whether they were inherently inferior. The brown bomber had been human after all, vulnerable, beatable. For white America, reactions were mixed and revealing. Some were openly relieved, happy the Black fighter had been beaten, glad the natural order had been restored. The anxiety they'd felt watching Louis dominate white fighters was eased. Things were back to normal. Others were genuinely disappointed. They'd believed in Louis, had seen him as different from Jack Johnson, had wanted him to succeed because he followed the rules, stayed humble, made them comfortable. But now he was just another fighter who'd been hyped up and proven unworthy. But the worst, most significant, most dangerous reaction came from Nazi Germany. The propaganda machine seized on the victory immediately and completely. Within hours, German newspapers were running huge headlines. Schmeling knocks out the Negro. Aryan superiority proven. The Führer's fighter defeats Black American. Adolf Hitler himself sent a personal telegram to Schmeling, congratulating him. The message was brief but significant. It elevated the fight from sports to politics, made Schmeling's victory a victory for the Nazi state. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, used the fight in speeches within days. This was proof, he declared, to packed rallies. Proof of what the party had been saying all along. Proof that their racial theories were scientific fact. Proof that Aryans were superior to other races, especially to black people. The German state-controlled media went into overdrive. Newsreels of the fight were shown in theaters across Germany. Schmeling's victory was celebrated as a triumph not just for one man, but for the entire German nation, for the Nazi ideology, for Hitler's vision of racial hierarchy. The narrative was explicit and disgusting. The white German had defeated the Black American. The superior race had proven its superiority. This was nature. This was destiny. This was truth. Max Schmeling returned to Germany a conquering hero. His ship docked in Hamburg to massive crowds. A parade in Berlin, personally received by Hitler at the Reich Chancellery, featured prominently in propaganda films, held up as the perfect example of Aryan superiority. Schmeling himself was deeply uncomfortable with much of this. He wasn't a member of the Nazi Party, didn't share Hitler's ideology, had Jewish friends and business partners, personally liked and respected Joe Louis. But in Nazi Germany in 1936, you didn't get to separate yourself from the state. Your victories belonged to the Führer. Your success validated the ideology. Resistance was impossible. The Nazi propaganda machine had taken Schmeling's victory and transformed it into something monstrous, used it to justify racism, to promote their theories of racial superiority, to validate an ideology that would ultimately lead to genocide. And without a counter-narrative, without Joe Louis getting another chance to fight Schmeling and set the record straight, this Nazi version of the story would stand, would become historical fact, would be used to oppress and murder millions. Joe Louis left Yankee Stadium that night in the back of a car. Trainers helped him. Doctors checked him. His face was swollen almost beyond recognition. Both eyes nearly shut. Lips split. Every part of his face throbbing with pain. But the physical injuries would heal. The emotional damage went deeper. Much deeper. He'd been so confident. So certain. Had looked past Schmeling to the championship. Had taken the fight for granted. And he'd been punished for that arrogance. Destroyed in front of 60,000 people. In front of millions on the radio. In front of his people. The shame was crushing. The sense of failure overwhelming. He'd let everyone down. Black America had invested their hope in him. Their pride. Their belief that excellence could transcend racism. And he'd failed them. At the hospital, doctors examined him. Confirmed facial injuries, but nothing serious. No broken bones, no permanent damage. Physically, he'd recover. But Louis wasn't worried about the physical recovery. He was worried about whether he could ever come back from this emotionally. In the weeks that followed, Louis struggled with depression. Couldn't sleep. Replayed the fight in his mind constantly. Saw Schmeling's right hand coming. Felt himself hitting the canvas. Heard the count. Felt the shame. Friends and family tried to comfort him. Told him it was just one fight. That he was still young. Still talented. That he could come back. But Louis wasn't sure. The loss had shaken his confidence to its core. But slowly, gradually, something changed. The depression began lifting. The shame transformed into something else. Determination. Hunger. Focus. Joe Louis made a decision. He would learn from this, would study what went wrong, would fix the weakness Schmeling had exploited, would work harder than ever, would come back stronger, and someday, somehow, he'd get another chance at Max Schmeling. When that day came, it would be different. The overconfident fighter who'd lost would be gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, more focused. Max Schmeling had won this battle, but Joe Louis would win the war. The weeks after the Schmeling loss were the darkest period of Joe Louis's life. Darker even than the poverty of his childhood in Alabama. Darker than the struggle of arriving in Detroit with nothing. Because this darkness came from within. From shame, from failure, from the crushing weight of disappointed hopes. The physical injuries healed relatively quickly. The swelling went down within days. The cuts closed. The bruises faded. Within 2 weeks, you could barely tell he'd been in a fight. But the emotional wounds were different. Those wounds were deep, raw, and they took much longer to heal. Louis struggled to leave his apartment. Didn't want to face people. Didn't want to see the disappointment in their eyes. The pity. Worse, the confirmation of doubts they'd always harbored but been too polite to voice. Maybe he really wasn't good enough. Maybe the hype had been premature. Maybe Schmeling had exposed the truth. Black newspapers tried to be supportive, wrote articles about how one loss didn't define a fighter, about how champions had lost before and come back, about how Louis was still young, still talented, still had time. But even in their encouragement, Louis could sense the disappointment, the doubt. His managers, John Roxborough and Julian Black, were worried, not just about Louis's mental state, but about his career viability. Promoters were already questioning whether Louis was still a marketable fighter, whether anyone would pay to see him after such a devastating loss, whether the aura was gone forever. But after a week of letting Louis grieve, letting him process the loss fully, they came to him with a plan. They would rebuild, start from scratch, fix the technical flaws, but more importantly, fix the mental approach. The overconfidence that had led to the loss would be replaced with humility and constant vigilance. The first order of business was the dropped left hand, the weakness Schmeling had exploited so mercilessly. Louis spent hours every day in front of mirrors, throwing jabs, watching his left hand, training his body to return it immediately to guard position with no drop, no gap, no opening. It was tedious work, mind-numbing, boring, thousands and thousands of jabs. But Louis did it without complaint. He understood now what complacency cost, what overlooking details meant. He would never make that mistake again. His chief trainer, Jack Blackburn, worked with him relentlessly. Blackburn was an ex-fighter himself, knew the mental game as well as the physical. He pushed Louis hard, but also built him back up, reminded him of his gifts, his speed, his power, his intelligence in the ring. "You're still the best fighter I've ever trained," Blackburn would say, "but you needed to learn this lesson, needed to understand that talent isn't enough, that every fight matters, that there are no easy opponents. Now you know, now you'll be better." Louis also worked on other aspects of his defense: head movement, footwork, reading opponents more carefully, being less predictable. The overconfidence was gone, replaced by a craftsman's attention to every detail. 2 months after the Schmeling loss, in August 1936, Louis fought again, against Jack Sharkey at Yankee Stadium, the same venue where he'd been knocked out, coming back to face the demons. Sharkey was a former heavyweight champion, 34 years old, past his prime, but still a legitimate opponent. A real test of whether Louis could bounce back. The fight was scheduled for 10 rounds. Louis needed to prove himself, needed to show the loss to Schmeling was an aberration, a learning experience, not the beginning of a decline. Round 1. Louis came out careful, measured. His left hand stayed up after every jab. His defense was tighter. Sharkey was experienced, crafty, tried to lure Louis into mistakes, but Louis was patient, waited for his opportunities. Round 3. Louis landed a perfect combination, Right hand to the body. Left hook to the head. Sharkey went down. Got up at 8. Lewis pressed forward. Another combination. Sharkey down again. Couldn't continue. The referee stopped it. 3rd round knockout. Clean. Dominant. Professional. Joe Louis was back. The victory felt good, but Lewis didn't celebrate excessively. Followed the rules even now. Stayed humble. But inside, he felt something crucial. Confidence returning. Belief that the Schmeling loss hadn't broken him. That he could still fight. Still win. Still achieve his goals. Over the next 10 months, from August 1936 to June 1937, Joe Louis fought 6 more times. Won all 6. 5 by knockout. The opponents varied in quality, but Louis destroyed them all. Some were legitimate contenders. Others were stepping stones. Didn't matter. Louis beat them all with a new intensity. January 1937. Bob Pastor. Louis won by decision. Fought smart. Patient. Didn't get the knockout, but showed he could box. Could win on points. Could be tactical when necessary. February 1937. Nady Brown. Knockout in the 4th round. Back to devastating form. The victories kept coming. Each one rebuilding Louis' reputation. Proving the Schmeling loss was a fluke. That Louis had learned from it. That he was better now than before. But these weren't just boxing matches. They were statements. Proof to himself and to the world that Joe Louis wasn't finished. That one loss didn't define him. That champions respond to defeat by working harder, getting better, refusing to quit. By early 1937, Louis had earned what he'd been denied after the Schmeling loss, a shot at the heavyweight championship. James J. Braddock, the current champion, agreed to fight him. The bout was scheduled for June 22, 1937 in Chicago. Braddock was an interesting opponent. 32 years old, not the most talented heavyweight champion ever, but tough, experienced, had won the title in 1935 as a massive underdog, beating Max Baer. His nickname was the Cinderella Man because he'd come from nothing, survived poverty during the Depression, and against all odds become champion. The fight would be Louis's chance at redemption, to achieve what should have happened a year earlier, to become heavyweight champion, to fulfill the promise, to make Black America proud. The training camp for Braddock was different than the camp for Schmeling had been. Intense, focused. Louis trained like his life depended on it, because in a sense it did. Another loss would end his championship dreams, might end his career. This was his chance, maybe his only chance. Jack Blackburn pushed him hard, sparring partners of every style, working on every aspect of his game. The jab was perfect now. The left hand stayed up. The defense was tight, but the power was still there. The combinations still devastating. Louis was becoming a more complete fighter. June 22, 1937, Comiskey Park, Chicago, home of the White Sox, converted for the night into a boxing venue. 45,000 people packed every seat. Another massive crowd. Millions more listening on the radio. The atmosphere was different than it had been before Schmeling. Less certainty, less confidence. People hoped Louis would win, but weren't sure. The aura of invincibility was gone. Louis was beatable. Everyone knew that now. For Black America, this fight meant everything. Louis had carried their hopes before and lost. This was his chance at redemption. Their chance at redemption. The churches held prayer services. Families gathered around radios across the country, hoping, praying, believing. The fighters entered the ring, Louis in his white trunks, calm, focused, following the rules. Braddock in dark trunks, experienced, ready. The champion defending his title against the young challenger. The bell rang. Round 1. Louis came forward, establishing his jab. Braddock circled, waiting, patient. 30 seconds into the round, Braddock landed a big right hand, caught Louis on the jaw. Louis went down, hit the canvas. The crowd gasped, "Not again. Please, not again." But this time was different. Louis got up at the count of 2. Wasn't hurt badly. Wasn't phased. The knockdown was a good punch, not a sign of dominance. Louis had learned from Schmeling. Getting knocked down didn't mean you were beaten. It meant you had to get back up and fight. The round continued. Louis regained his composure, started landing his jab. By the end of round 1, he'd taken control. The knockdown was forgotten. He was boxing his fight now. Round 2 through 7, Louis breaking Braddock down systematically. Landing combinations, working the body, setting up the knockout, patient, controlled, smart. This was the new Joe Louis. Better than before, more complete. Braddock was tough, experienced, knew how to survive. But Louis was too good, too fast, too powerful. The champion was being outclassed. Round 8, 2 minutes in. Louis saw his opening, landed a perfect right hand to Braddock's body. The champion's face twisted in pain. His guard dropped. Louis stepped in, fired a left hook, caught Braddock on the jaw. Braddock went down, fell hard. The referee started counting. 1, 2, 3. Braddock wasn't moving. 4, 5, 6, still down. 7, 8, 9, 10. The fight was over. Joe Louis was heavyweight champion of the world. The crowd in Comiskey Park exploded. 45,000 people losing their minds, screaming, cheering, celebrating. But that was nothing compared to what was happening across Black America. In Harlem, people flooded into the streets. Thousands of people, dancing, singing, crying, hugging strangers, complete strangers embracing because they shared this moment, this victory, this pride. Cars honking, people hanging out of windows, music blaring, a party that would last for days. In Detroit, Paradise Valley became a massive celebration. Louis's hometown, the kid from Black Bottom, the boy who delivered ice, now heavyweight champion of the world. People were crying, grown men weeping with joy. This was their Joe, their champion. In Chicago, the South Side exploded. In Los Angeles, Central Avenue. In Atlanta, Auburn Avenue. In every city with a significant black population, the reaction was the same. Pure, unrestrained joy. This meant more than just a boxing victory. It meant proof. Proof that black excellence was undeniable. Proof that racism was a lie. Proof that given a fair chance, a level playing field, black Americans could be the best in the world. Churches held special services of Thanksgiving. Preachers incorporated Louis into sermons about perseverance, redemption, faith. Children were named after him. Joe Louis became more than a man. He became a symbol, an icon, a living embodiment of possibility. White America's reaction was more complicated. Some newspapers celebrated Louis, acknowledged his achievement, recognized his skill, but always with qualifications, always with references to how humble he was, how respectful, how different from Jack Johnson, as if his acceptability depended on his deference. Other white Americans were less enthusiastic, uncomfortable with a black champion, already looking for white fighters to challenge him, to restore what they saw as the natural order. But they couldn't deny what Louis had done, couldn't argue with the knockout, couldn't dismiss his skill. In the ring, Louis was characteristically humble. The referee raised his hand. The crowd roared. Louis didn't smile, didn't celebrate excessively, just nodded. Professional. Following the rules even in his greatest triumph. But his trainers saw his face, saw the relief, the joy, the vindication. 1 year after Schmeling, Joe Louis had achieved his dream, was heavyweight champion, had proven the doubters wrong, had shown that one loss didn't define him. In post-fight interviews, Louis credited his trainers, thanked his managers, said he was blessed to have the opportunity, said he would work to be a worthy champion. All the right words, all the expected humility. But inside, he felt something deeper. Pride, accomplishment, proof that hard work mattered, that learning from failure was possible, that redemption was real. He was 23 years old, heavyweight champion of the world, the first black champion in 22 years, the youngest champion since 1899. He'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. But even in this moment of ultimate triumph, there was a shadow. Max Schmeling, still in Germany, still claiming he'd beaten Louis, still saying the title should be his, still being held up by Nazi propaganda as proof of Aryan superiority. German newspapers barely covered Louis's title win. When they did mention it, they dismissed it, said it didn't matter. Schmeling had already beaten Louis. That was what mattered. The title was irrelevant compared to the fact that the German fighter had knocked out the black American. Louis knew the truth. He was champion, yes, but the victory was incomplete. The loss to Schmeling haunted him, would haunt him until he got another chance, until he could prove that loss was an aberration, until he could show the world who the better fighter really was. And by 1938, as the world got darker, as Hitler's Germany became more aggressive, as war seemed inevitable, that rematch took on meaning far beyond personal redemption. It would become the most important fight in history. Democracy versus fascism. America versus Nazi Germany. Joe Louis versus everything Schmeling was forced to represent. The rematch was coming. Everyone knew it. The only questions were when and what it would mean. Joe Louis was ready. He'd been preparing for this moment since the night Schmeling knocked him out, since the moment he got up from that hospital bed, determined to be better. The champion was ready. And the world was about to find out what a prepared, focused, motivated Joe Louis could do. June 22nd, 1938. Exactly 1 year after Joe Louis had won the heavyweight championship by knocking out James J. Braddock. Exactly 2 years after Max Schmeling had knocked him out. The rematch was scheduled, Yankee Stadium, New York, the same venue where Louis had been humiliated in 1936, coming back to exercise the demons, to settle the score, to prove what needed proving. But the world in 1938 was completely different than it had been in 1936. Darker, more dangerous, more on the precipice of catastrophe. And this fight, which would have been significant in any era, was taking on meaning far beyond boxing, far beyond sports, far beyond personal revenge. Nazi Germany in 1938 was no longer the country that had hosted the Olympics 2 years earlier. It had transformed into something monstrous. The mask of respectability had been torn away. The true nature of Hitler's regime was becoming clear to anyone willing to see. In March 1938, just 3 months before the fight, Germany had annexed Austria in what they called the Anschluss. Hitler's troops marched into Vienna unopposed. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. The world protested, but did nothing. Hitler's aggression was rewarded with territorial expansion. Czechoslovakia was next. Everyone knew it. Hitler was making demands, threatening invasion, claiming the Sudetenland. The world watched nervously. Britain and France tried diplomacy, tried appeasement, tried to avoid war, but war seemed inevitable. The question was when, not if. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 had stripped Jews of citizenship and basic rights. By 1938, those laws were being enforced with increasing brutality. Jewish businesses were being seized. Jewish families were fleeing Germany if they could. Those who couldn't were trapped in a nightmare that would only get worse. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, was coming in November 1938, just 5 months after the Louis Schmeling fight. Nazi mobs would attack Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and Austria. Hundreds would be killed, thousands arrested and sent to concentration camps. The world would finally understand what Nazi Germany truly was. But even before Kristallnacht, the signs were everywhere. Hitler's rhetoric had escalated from threatening to openly genocidal. Nazi ideology wasn't just theory anymore. It was policy. It was action. It was violence sanctioned and encouraged by the state. And Max Schmeling, whether he wanted it or not, represented this. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent 2 years using his 1936 victory as proof of everything Hitler preached. Proof of Aryan superiority. Proof that racial hierarchy was scientific fact. Proof that white Germans were superior to black Americans. Schmeling himself was deeply uncomfortable with this. He'd tried to distance himself from Nazi ideology, had maintained his Jewish business relationships, had refused to join the Nazi Party. But in Hitler's Germany, you didn't get to refuse. Not really. Not if you wanted to survive. Not if you wanted to continue your career. The German sports authorities and Nazi propaganda officials framed the upcoming rematch in explicitly racial terms. This wasn't just boxing. It was a test. A proving ground. The Black American champion versus the German challenger. When Schmeling won, and they were certain he would, it would validate everything. Prove the ideology correct. Show the world that Nazi racial theories were truth. In America, the fight was being framed differently, but just as significantly. This was democracy versus fascism, freedom versus tyranny, the American way versus the Nazi way. Joe Louis wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his country, for the values America claimed to represent. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt invited Joe Louis to the White House, an unprecedented honor for any athlete, let alone a black athlete in 1938 America. The meeting took place in the Oval Office. Just Louis, FDR, and a few advisors. Roosevelt was in his wheelchair, paralyzed from polio since 1921. The press never showed this, maintained the fiction that the president could walk. But in private, Roosevelt was frank about his condition. He greeted Louis warmly, shook his hand, then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He reached up and grabbed Louis's arm, felt his bicep, squeezed the muscle, and said words that would echo through history. "Joe, we need muscles like yours to beat Germany." The message was clear, explicit, unmistakable. This wasn't just a boxing match. This was about the coming war. About America versus Nazi Germany. About proving that democracy was stronger than fascism. That freedom was more powerful than tyranny. The President of the United States had just told Joe Louis that his fight mattered to the nation. That he was representing something larger than himself. That the world would be watching. That America needed him to win. The pressure on Louis was crushing, unimaginable. He'd already been carrying the hopes of Black America. Now he was carrying the hopes of the entire country, of democracy itself, of everyone who opposed Hitler. The weight would have broken most people. But Joe Louis had grown up carrying weight. Born in a sharecropper's cabin, raised in poverty, escaped the Jim Crow South, built himself into a champion while following rules that stripped away his personality. He knew how to carry pressure, knew how to fight when everything was on the line. The build-up to the fight was unlike anything boxing had ever seen. Every newspaper in America covered it, not in the sports section, on the front page. This was news, real news, important news, political news. Every radio station talked about it. Commentators discussed not just the boxing, but the symbolism. What it meant for America. What it meant for the world. What a Louis victory would represent. What a Schmeling victory would mean. People who'd never watched a fight before were planning to tune in. This transcended sports, transcended entertainment. This was about who we were as a nation, what we stood for, what we believed. Max Schmeling arrived in New York in early June. German press accompanied him. Nazi officials sent messages of support. The propaganda machine was already preparing victory materials, newsreels to be shown across Germany, speeches celebrating Aryan triumph, evidence for the ideology. Schmeling's public statements were measured, respectful of Louis, acknowledged his improvement, but confident. He'd beaten Louis before, had found the weakness, could exploit it again. The game plan would be the same. Wait for the dropped left hand. Counter with the right cross. Be patient. The knockout would come. But what Schmeling didn't fully understand was how much Louis had changed, how the loss had transformed him, how 2 years of work had eliminated not just the technical flaw, but the mental weakness. The overconfidence was gone, replaced by focused determination and cold calculation. The training camps revealed everything. Schmeling trained as he always had, professional, thorough, confident. He was in good shape, ready to fight. But there was a sense of routine to it. He'd been here before, done this before, would do it again. Lewis's training camp was different. Intense in a way his trainers had never seen. Lewis was possessed, obsessed. Every sparring session was a war. Every drill was executed perfectly. He wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing for a reckoning. Jack Blackburn, his chief trainer, watched Lewis work and saw something that worried him as much as it impressed him. Lewis was so focused, so intense, so consumed by the need to beat Schmeling, that Blackburn worried he might be too tight, might be wound so hard he'd snap. But Lewis wasn't worried. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't rage. It was controlled fury, calculated violence, purpose. He'd spent 2 years preparing for this moment. 2 years working on defense. 2 years eliminating weaknesses. 2 years getting better. The weigh-in was tense. Louis stone-faced. No expression, no emotion. Pure focus. Schmeling confident. Friendly even. Trying to project calm. Both fighters weighed about the same as their first fight. Both in excellent condition. The press asked questions. Lewis gave minimal answers. Yes, he was ready. No, he wasn't overconfident this time. He respected Schmeling. Would fight his best fight. That was all. Schmeling was more talkative. Predicted victory. Said he'd found Lewis's weakness once and could do it again. The reporters wrote their stories. Most predicted Schmeling would win. The odds were much closer than in 1936. Some bookies had it even. Others slightly favored Schmeling. The man who'd knocked Lewis out versus the champion who'd learned from defeat. Nobody knew what would happen. June 22nd, 1938. Fight day. Yankee Stadium began filling early. 70,000 seats. Every single one would be filled. Another 10,000 people would be turned away at the gates. Demand was unprecedented. Outside the stadium, millions of Americans prepared to listen on the radio. In homes across the country, families gathered around radios. In bars, crowds packed in. In community centers, especially in black neighborhoods, people gathered en masse. This was bigger than the first fight, bigger than any sporting event in American history. An estimated 100 million people worldwide would listen. The largest radio audience ever assembled. In Europe, in South America, in Africa, in Asia, people were tuning in. The entire planet was watching, waiting. This fight mattered to everyone. In black neighborhoods across America, the atmosphere was electric. In Harlem, people gathered around radios like they were gathering around the voice of God. This was their champion, going into battle, their hope, their pride, their proof. In Detroit, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in every city with significant black population, the same scene. Churches held prayer services. People who hadn't prayed in years were praying now. Children were sent to bed, but snuck to doorways to listen. This was bigger than any of them. This was history. In Germany, the fight was being broadcast. Nazi officials gathered to listen. Confident. Certain. Schmeling had beaten Lewis before. Would beat him again. The propaganda materials were ready. The victory celebration planned. This would be a great day for the Reich. Inside Yankee Stadium, the atmosphere was beyond electric. 70,000 people generating noise that could be heard miles away. The evening was clear. Perfect weather. The ring was lit by massive spotlights. Everything else in shadow. The stage was set. In Joe Louis's dressing room, the champion sat quietly. His trainers moved around him, taping hands, checking gloves, giving final instructions. But Lewis wasn't listening. He was in his own world, visualizing, preparing. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, working for, living for these past 2 years. Jack Blackburn looked at his fighter, saw something in Lewis's eyes he'd never quite seen before. Something cold, something dangerous. This wasn't the overconfident fighter from 1936. This wasn't even the champion who'd beaten Braddock. This was something else, something refined, perfected, lethal. In Schmeling's dressing room, the German fighter was confident. Relaxed even. He'd beaten Louis before. Badly. Found the weakness. Exploited it. Nothing suggested he couldn't do it again. The game plan was clear. Be patient. Wait for the opening. Counter with the right hand. Win. The call came. Time to walk to the ring. Louis stood, shadowboxed briefly. His movements were fluid. Perfect. No wasted motion. This was a fighter at his absolute peak. 24 years old. In the best shape of his life. Ready. The walk to the ring felt like a dream. The roar of the crowd. The lights. The noise. 70,000 people on their feet. Screaming. Louis climbed through the ropes. Wore his white trunks. Bounced lightly. Stayed calm. Followed the rules even now. Schmeling entered moments later. The crowd's reaction was different than in 1936. Less polite applause. More hostile. Some boos. America had changed its view of Germany in the past 2 years. Schmeling represented something Americans increasingly feared and hated. The referee, Arthur Donovan, the same referee from the first fight, called both fighters to the center of the ring. Final instructions. The words every referee says. Protect yourself at all times. Break when I say break. Touch gloves and come out fighting. Louis and Schmeling touched gloves. A brief moment. Two men who would spend the next minutes trying to hurt each other. They returned to their corners. Trainers climbing out. Stools removed. The ring cleared, except for the referee and two fighters. The announcer's voice boomed across the stadium. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the main event for the heavyweight championship of the world, scheduled for 15 rounds. The crowd roared. Couldn't even hear the rest of the announcement. The noise was physical, overwhelming. And in this corner, the challenger, from Germany, weighing 193 pounds, Max Schmeling. Mixed reaction. Some applause, some boos. 70,000 people showing their allegiance. And in this corner, the heavyweight champion of the world, from Detroit, Michigan, weighing 198 3/4 pounds, Joe Louis. The roar was deafening. 70,000 people losing their minds. This was their champion, their hope, their answer to Hitler, their proof that excellence had no color. The referee gave final instructions to both fighters, looked them in the eyes, satisfied they were ready, stepped back, gestured to the timekeeper. The bell rang. The bell rang for round one. Joe Louis moved forward immediately. No caution, no feeling out process, no patience, just pure, focused, calculated aggression. He'd waited 2 years for this moment. 2 years of thinking about it, dreaming about it, preparing for it. The wait was over. Schmeling circled to his right, defensive stance, patient like before, waiting for that dropped left hand, waiting for Louis to jab, waiting for the opening he'd exploited so effectively 2 years ago. But Louis wasn't giving him anything. His guard was perfect, tight, his left hand high, his movements different than 1936. Faster, more controlled, more dangerous. Louis threw a jab, sharp, quick. His left hand returned to guard position instantly. No drop, no gap, no opening. Schmeling tried to counter, but there was nothing to counter. The weakness was gone. Louis threw another jab, then another, establishing his range, setting up what would come next. Schmeling circled, his confidence from the dressing room starting to erode. Something was different. Louis was different. Louis stepped forward, threw a jab. Schmeling started to counter, but Louis was already gone, had slipped to the side, fired a right hand to Schmeling's body. The punch landed with devastating force, a thudding sound that could be heard in the first few rows. Schmeling's eyes widened. That hurt. That hurt more than anything Louis had landed in their first fight. Louis pressed forward. No space. No time to recover. No time to think. Another jab. Another body shot. Schmeling was already in trouble. 30 seconds into the fight, the entire game plan was falling apart. The crowd was rising. 70,000 people sensing blood, sensing something historic. This was different than 1936. Louis was hunting, attacking, overwhelming. Louis fired a combination. Jab, jab, right hand to the body, left hook to the head. Every punch landed clean. Schmeling tried to defend, covered up, but Louis was finding him anyway. Punches coming from every angle. Schmeling stumbled backward, hit the ropes. Louis followed. Through another combination, Schmeling's head snapped back. His legs weren't working right. Everything was happening too fast. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Louis saw his opening, planted his feet, threw a perfect right hand directly to Schmeling's jaw. The punch was clean, pure, devastating. Schmeling's eyes rolled. His body went stiff. He fell to one knee. The crowd exploded. 70,000 people erupting, screaming. The noise was beyond description. Radio announcers were shouting into microphones, trying to describe what was happening, struggling to keep up with the action. The referee started counting. 1, 2, 3. Schmeling got to his feet at 4, trying to show he was okay, trying to buy time, trying to clear his head, but his eyes were unfocused. His legs were shaking. The referee looked at him carefully, checked his eyes, wiped off his gloves. Satisfied, he could continue. Waved Louis forward. Louis showed no mercy, no hesitation, came forward like a machine. This was what he'd prepared for, what he'd visualized, this moment. Louis fired combinations from every angle. Left hook, right hand, left hook, right hand to the body. Schmeling tried to fight back, threw a right hand, but Louis slipped it easily, countered immediately. 3 punches in return. Schmeling was covering up, trying to survive, trying to make it out of the round, but Louis wouldn't let him. Kept throwing, kept landing. The punches were accumulating, the damage building. Louis landed another massive right hand, same spot as before, directly on the jaw. Schmeling went down hard, on his back this time, flat. The crowd was insane. 70,000 people making noise that shook the stadium foundations. The referee began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Schmeling struggled to his feet, grabbed the ropes, pulled himself up. His legs were gone, completely gone. His corner was screaming at the referee to stop it. Their fighter was being destroyed. This was torture. But Schmeling gestured that he wanted to continue. Proud, tough, a fighter to the end. The referee looked at him, saw the damage, almost stopped it. But Schmeling insisted, raised his gloves. I can fight. The referee allowed it to continue. Would later say he regretted it. Should have stopped it then. Louis came forward. No hesitation. No mercy. This was about sending a message. About proving something. About showing the world what happened when you underestimated Joe Louis. He fired another combination. Right hand to Schmeling's body. Left hook. Right hand. Every punch landing with full force. Schmeling's face twisted in pain. That body shot might have broken ribs, fractured bones, internal damage. Schmeling turned his back, a defensive instinct, trying to protect himself from the onslaught, trying to survive. The referee jumped in, warned him sternly, you can't turn your back, have to face your opponent. Schmeling turned back around, raised his gloves, but his eyes were empty. The fight was gone. His body was just going through motions now. Louis stepped forward, fired a left hook, caught Schmeling perfectly on the jaw. The punch had everything behind it. All the power, all the anger, all the determination. 2 years of preparation in one punch. Schmeling fell into the ropes, was literally hanging on them. The only thing keeping him upright. His arms draped over the top rope, his face a mask of pain and defeat. He was barely conscious, couldn't defend himself, couldn't fight back, couldn't continue. The referee, Arthur Donovan, jumped between them, waved his arms. Fight over. Stopped. Done. He'd seen enough. This was over. 2 minutes and 4 seconds. 124 seconds total. Joe Louis had destroyed Max Schmeling. The referee stopped it, and the stadium erupted. 70,000 people losing their collective minds, screaming, crying, jumping, hugging strangers. The noise was beyond anything any of them had experienced. This wasn't just a fight. This was redemption. This was justice. This was proof. Joe Louis stepped back, professional even now. No excessive celebration, no gloating, following the rules his managers had set. But if you looked closely at his face, you could see it. Relief, vindication, satisfaction. 2 years of work, 2 years of waiting, 2 years of carrying the shame. It was over. Schmeling's corner rushed into the ring. Doctors, trainers. He was barely able to stand. They helped him to his stool, checked him over. His face was swollen, his ribs screaming with pain. He'd later be diagnosed with 2 broken vertebrae in his back from the body shots, fractured ribs, severe facial injuries. He would spend weeks in the hospital. Radio announcers were shouting into microphones, trying to describe what had just happened, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. Louis has done it. Louis has destroyed Schmeling. In just over 2 minutes, the champion has avenged his only loss. In Harlem, the explosion of joy was immediate and total. People flooded into the streets by the thousands, dancing, singing, crying, screaming, complete strangers embracing, grown men weeping openly, women shouting hallelujah, children running through the streets in pure joy. The party in Harlem would last for 3 days, bars giving away free drinks, restaurants feeding people for free, music pouring from every window, cars honking constantly, people hanging from fire escapes. The entire neighborhood transformed into one massive celebration. In Detroit's Paradise Valley, the reaction was the same. This was their Joe, the kid from Black Bottom, the boy who'd delivered ice, who'd hidden boxing gloves in his violin case. Now, he'd avenged his only loss, proven himself, destroyed the man who'd humiliated him. In Chicago's South Side, celebrations blocked traffic, people dancing in the streets. Police didn't even try to control it. Just let it happen. Let people celebrate. This was too big, too important, too meaningful. In Los Angeles, in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, in every city with a significant black population, the same scene. Pure, unrestrained, overwhelming joy. Churches held spontaneous services. Preachers incorporated Louis into sermons about redemption, about perseverance, about God's justice. He was knocked down, but he got back up. He was defeated, but he didn't quit. He faced his demon, and he destroyed it. This meant everything to Black America. More than just a boxing match. More than revenge. More than sports. This was proof. Proof that excellence was undeniable. Proof that racism was a lie. Proof that when given a fair chance, a level playing field, Black Americans could be the best in the world. Joe Louis had done something unprecedented, had unified Black America in celebration, had given them a moment of pure pride, pure joy, pure validation. In a country that gave them so little reason to feel proud, Joe Louis had given them this, and they would never forget it. White America was celebrating too. Not everywhere, not everyone. There were still millions of white Americans who hated seeing a black champion, who would never accept Louis no matter what he did. But millions of other white Americans were celebrating, standing in their living rooms applauding, shouting at their radios, excited, proud. Not just proud of Louis, but proud of America. Proud that their champion had beaten Hitler's fighter. Proud that democracy had struck a blow against fascism. This was a rare moment in American history. A brief window where white and black Americans were celebrating the same thing. Where racial divisions temporarily dissolved in shared joy. Where Joe Louis belonged to everyone, was everyone's champion, everyone's hero, everyone's proof. The moment wouldn't last. The racial divisions would reassert themselves. The celebration would end, and reality would return. But for this night, for these hours, America was united. Black and white, rich and poor, north and south, all celebrating Joe Louis standing over Max Schmeling. Newspaper headlines the next morning reflected this. Front page stories, not sports section. Front page. Louis destroys Schmeling in 124 seconds. Champion avenges 1936 loss. America defeats Germany. The fight was being framed explicitly in national terms. This wasn't just boxing. This was symbolic warfare. Democracy versus fascism. Freedom versus tyranny. America versus Nazi Germany. And America had won. In Germany, the reaction was the opposite of celebration. Shock, disbelief, horror. This wasn't supposed to happen. Schmeling was supposed to win, was supposed to prove Aryan's superiority again, was supposed to validate the ideology. Instead, he'd been destroyed, humiliated, knocked out in just over 2 minutes. The entire Nazi narrative had been shattered in 124 seconds. Adolf Hitler was listening to the fight. When it became clear Schmeling was losing, Hitler walked out. Couldn't watch, couldn't listen. The symbolic defeat was too much, too damaging, too destructive to the mythology the Nazis had built. After the fight, Hitler issued orders. German newspapers were forbidden from reporting the full details. The coverage was to be minimal, buried on back pages. The truth suppressed. The German people were not to know how completely Schmeling had been beaten. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was furious. 2 years of work. 2 years of using Schmeling's 1936 victory as proof of racial theories. 2 years of propaganda. All destroyed in 124 seconds. The prepared victory materials were destroyed. The newsreels, the speeches, the celebration plans. All of it useless now. The narrative had been shattered. The lie exposed. Because that's what those 124 seconds proved. That Nazi racial theories were lies. That Aryan superiority was fiction. That race had nothing to do with fighting ability. With courage. With heart. With excellence. Max Schmeling had beaten Joe Louis in 1936 when Louis was overconfident and unprepared. The Nazis claimed this proved white superiority. But in the rematch, when Louis was focused and prepared, he destroyed Schmeling. If the first fight proved racial superiority, what did the second fight prove? The answer was obvious. Race had nothing to do with it. Preparation mattered. Focus mattered. Work mattered. But skin color? Irrelevant. The Nazi propaganda machine went silent on the Schmeling fight. Changed the subject. Focused on other things. Tried to make people forget. But the damage was done. Anyone paying attention had seen the truth. The ideology was a lie, and Joe Louis had proven it with his fists. In the ring at Yankee Stadium, as the celebration continued, as reporters tried to get to Louis, as the crowd slowly began to disperse, the full weight of what had happened was starting to sink in. This fight would be remembered as the most significant sporting event in history. More than just boxing. More than just sports. This was a moment when athletics became politics, when a boxing ring became a battlefield for ideologies. Joe Louis had done something unprecedented, had struck a blow against fascism before World War II even officially began, had proven that Nazi racial theories were lies, had unified America in a way nothing else could, had given Black Americans a moment of pure pride and validation. The 124 seconds of violence had become an act of defiance. A statement, a proof that would echo through history. One man, two fists, 124 seconds, and the world changed. The victory over Max Schmeling on June 22, 1938, transformed Joe Louis's status in America. He went from being a great fighter to being an American hero, from being a black champion to being America's champion. The distinction mattered enormously. In the segregated America of 1938, black excellence was usually confined to black communities. White America might acknowledge it grudgingly, but wouldn't embrace it. Joe Louis broke through that barrier completely. White Americans didn't just respect him anymore. They claimed him. He was theirs, their champion, their symbol, their answer to Hitler. The hypocrisy was stunning if you thought about it. The same white Americans cheering for Louis lived in a country that enforced segregation, that denied black people the right to vote, that kept them in separate schools, separate restaurants, separate everything, that treated them as second-class citizens, at best. But they loved Joe Louis because he was humble, because he followed the rules, because he never threatened their comfort, because he beat the German, because he represented America against Nazi Germany. Louis understood this, understood that acceptance was conditional, that he was celebrated as long as he stayed in his lane, as long as he didn't challenge the system, as long as he remained the acceptable Negro. But he also understood that conditional acceptance was still progress, that being celebrated at all, even with qualifications, was better than being rejected completely. Between June 1938 and December 1941, Joe Louis defended his heavyweight championship 13 times, fought everyone they put in front of him, beat them all, most by knockout. The dominance was so complete that the press nicknamed this era the Bum of the Month Club. The nickname was unfair to Louis's opponents. These were legitimate fighters. Many were champions or former champions. Bob Pastor, Tony Galento, Billy Conn, John Henry Lewis. Serious fighters who would have been champions in any other era, but Joe Louis made them all look ordinary. Made the championship defenses look easy. He'd perfected his craft, fixed every weakness, become the most complete fighter of his generation. Maybe of any generation? The calm was still there, the control. But underneath was something harder than before. The loss to Schmeling had taught him never to be complacent, never to underestimate anyone, never to look past an opponent. Every fight mattered. Every opponent was dangerous until they weren't. Louis fought frequently, sometimes multiple times in a month. His managers and promoters wanted to maximize earnings while he was champion. The tax debt from his donated war purses was already growing. The more he fought, the more he earned, the more the IRS wanted. But Louis didn't complain. Fought whoever they put in front of him. Trained hard for every fight. Showed up. Did the work. Won. That was his life. Simple, focused, professional. Beyond boxing, Louis was becoming something bigger. A symbol of American strength and determination. When the newsreels showed him training, when newspapers printed photos of him, when he made public appearances, he represented American power, American values, American democracy. But the world was getting darker. Germany had invaded Poland in September 1939. World War II had officially begun. Britain and France declared war on Germany. But America stayed out, officially neutral, watching from across the Atlantic as Europe burned. Louis continued fighting, continued defending his title, continued being champion. But everyone knew American neutrality wouldn't last. The question was when America would enter the war, not if. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japanese planes attacked the U.S. naval base, killed more than 2,400 Americans, destroyed battleships, devastated the Pacific Fleet. America was at war. Suddenly. Completely. Inevitably. The next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. A date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fighting a two-front war, Pacific and Atlantic, Japan, and Germany. The country mobilized immediately. Young men enlisted or were drafted by the millions. Factories converted to war production. Everyone was expected to do their part, to contribute, to sacrifice. This was total war. Joe Louis was 27 years old, heavyweight champion of the world, at the absolute peak of his career and earning potential. He could have stayed out of it, could have continued boxing, could have sold war bonds and made speeches and boosted morale without actually serving. But the day after Pearl Harbor, Louis told his managers he wanted to enlist, wanted to join the army, wanted to serve. His managers tried to talk him out of it, explained what he'd be giving up. The money, the championship defenses, the earning years, the prime of his career. But Louis was adamant. His reasoning was simple and powerful. If young black men were being asked to risk their lives for America, the same America that treated them as second-class citizens, then Joe Louis, their champion, needed to be there with them, needed to serve alongside them, needed to show that the sacrifices mattered. In January 1942, Joe Louis enlisted in the U.S. Army. The headlines were massive. The champion was going to war. The symbolic weight was enormous. If Joe Louis believed in this fight, believed in America enough to give up his championship years, then maybe the cause was worth fighting for. The Army made Louis a sergeant, used him immediately for publicity and morale. His image appeared on recruiting posters. We're going to do our part, and we'll win because we're on God's side. Louis in uniform, powerful, symbolic, effective. But Louis wanted to do more than pose for photos, wanted to actually contribute. So he started organizing boxing exhibitions at military bases, would travel to camps across the country, box for the troops, boost morale, show them that America cared. The exhibitions were free. Louis didn't charge anything. This was service, contribution, the least he could do while men were dying overseas. But Louis went even further. In March 1942, he fought Buddy Baer in a championship defense at Madison Square Garden. The fight lasted 1 round. Louis knocked Baer out in under 3 minutes. The purse was $65,470. Louis donated every penny to the Navy Relief Fund. Every single dollar went to support the military. A month later, he fought Abe Simon, another championship defense, another first-round knockout. The purse was $45,882. Louis donated all of it to the Army Relief Fund. In total, Joe Louis donated over $100,000 to military charities in 1942. More than $1.5 million in today's money. A fortune. Money he could have kept. Money he needed. Money that would have helped pay down the tax debt already accumulating. But Louis believed the money should go to support the war effort, to help the families of soldiers, to contribute to victory. The federal government accepted the donations gratefully, but still expected Louis to pay full taxes on the money, as if he'd kept it, as if the donated income was taxable. Louis protested, argued that money donated to support the war effort shouldn't be taxed, that he was being penalized for patriotism. The IRS was unmoved. The tax code was clear. Income was income. Donations were donations. The two were separate. He owed what he owed. The debt began growing, compounding, a financial nightmare that would haunt Louis for the rest of his life. But in 1942, Louis wasn't thinking about taxes. He was thinking about service, about doing his part, about representing his country and his people with dignity and sacrifice. Over the next 4 years, Joe Louis traveled extensively, visited military bases across America and eventually overseas, boxed in exhibitions, talked to soldiers, signed autographs, took photos, boosted morale. He did 96 boxing exhibitions for the troops, fought for free, contributed his time and his body and his fame to the war effort. For black soldiers serving in a segregated military, Joe Louis represented something crucial, proof that they belonged, that they mattered, that they were Americans too. The military was strictly segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, often got the worst assignments, faced discrimination, even while fighting for their country. But when Joe Louis showed up at a base, black and white soldiers alike wanted to meet him, wanted to shake his hand, wanted to see the champ in person. For a brief moment, the racial divisions would blur. The shared humanity would emerge. Louis belonged to everyone. For white soldiers, Louis represented American strength, the man who'd beaten Hitler's fighter, the champion who'd given up his career to serve, the symbol of American determination. Meeting Louis boosted morale, made them feel connected to home, reminded them what they were fighting for. Louis took the work seriously. Every exhibition, every appearance, every photo. He understood the symbolic weight he carried, understood that his presence mattered, that morale mattered, that giving soldiers hope and pride and connection mattered. His most famous quote from the war years became iconic. "We'll win because we're on God's side." Simple words, but powerful. affirming that America was fighting for the right cause, against fascism, against tyranny, against the same Nazi ideology that had used Schmeling as a propaganda tool. For black soldiers serving in a segregated military, Lewis's statement was complicated. Were they on God's side when their own country treated them as inferior? When they couldn't vote? When they were segregated, even while fighting for freedom? But Louis represented hope that things could change, that the war would lead to progress at home, that their sacrifice would matter. The war years were hard on Louis financially and physically. He wasn't fighting championship bouts, wasn't earning big purses. The exhibitions were free, the donated money was gone, and the tax debt kept growing. Physically, the exhibitions took a toll. Lewis was boxing frequently, not at championship intensity, but still taking punches, accumulating wear. The body was breaking down slowly. The prime years were being spent in service rather than in championship defenses. But Lewis never complained, never expressed regret. This was his duty, his contribution, his way of serving. If men were dying overseas, the least he could do was box for them at home. In 1945, World War II ended. Germany surrendered in May, Japan in August. The war was over. America had won. The troops came home. The factories retooled. Life began returning to normal. Joe Louis was 31 years old, still heavyweight champion. Had held the title for 8 years despite not defending it regularly during the war. But he'd lost 4 prime years. 4 years at his physical peak. 4 years of earning potential. 4 years that could never be recovered. He returned to boxing. Needed to. The tax debt was crushing. The IRS was relentless. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. The only way to pay was to fight, to defend the championship, to earn purses. Between 1946 and 1949, Louis defended his title several more times, beat everyone they put in front of him. But the dominance wasn't quite the same. He was older, slower. The reflexes weren't as sharp. The power was still there, but the invincibility was gone. Observers noticed Louis was still good, still champion, but not the unstoppable force he'd been before the war. The 4 years had cost him. The body couldn't recover completely. Time was undefeated. In March 1949, at age 34, Joe Louis announced his retirement. He'd been heavyweight champion for nearly 12 years, longer than anyone before or since. Had defended the title 25 times, more than any heavyweight champion in history. Had achieved everything in boxing. Was universally recognized as one of the greatest fighters who ever lived. But retirement didn't bring peace, didn't bring financial security, didn't bring the comfortable life he'd earned. Because the tax debt was still there, growing, compounding. The IRS wouldn't let it go. And Joe Louis, the man who'd beaten Max Schmeling, who'd unified America, who'd served his country selflessly, was broke. Retirement should have been the beginning of Joe Louis's comfortable golden years. He was only 34 years old, had been heavyweight champion for 12 years, had achieved legendary status, had served his country heroically. By any measure, he'd earned respect, comfort, and financial security. But retirement brought none of those things. Instead, it brought the crushing reality of debt, the physical toll of years in the ring, and the mental anguish of watching everything slip away. The tax debt dominated everything. The IRS calculated that Louis owed over $500,000 in back taxes, more than $5 million in today's money. The debt came from multiple sources, but primarily from the purses he'd donated to military charities during the war. Louis had donated over $100,000 to the Navy Relief Fund and Army Relief Fund, money that went directly to support the war effort. But the IRS considered that income taxable income. The fact that he donated it was irrelevant to them. He'd earned it. Therefore, he owed taxes on it. Louis tried everything to get relief, appealed to the IRS, explained that he'd been a patriot, had served his country, had donated money to support the war, deserved consideration. The IRS was unmoved. The tax code was clear. Income was income. He owed what he owed. His lawyers tried legal challenges, argued that taxing donated war contributions was unjust, that Lewis was being penalized for patriotism. The courts sided with the IRS. The law was the law. No exceptions. Not even for war heroes. Politicians were asked to intervene. Surely Congress could pass legislation forgiving the debt, recognizing Lewis's service and sacrifice. But nothing happened. There were discussions, expressions of sympathy, but no action, no relief. Joe Louis, who'd represented America on the world stage, who'd struck a blow against fascism, who'd unified the nation, was being destroyed financially by his own government. The irony was crushing, the injustice obvious. But nothing changed. By 1950, Lewis was desperate. The debt was growing with interest and penalties. The IRS was garnishing any income he earned, taking everything. He couldn't get ahead, couldn't even keep pace, was drowning financially with no way to surface. So he made a decision that would end badly. He would come out of retirement, fight again, earn purses that might reduce the debt. It was the only option he could see. His managers and trainers tried to talk him out of it. Lewis was 36 years old, had been retired for a year. The body had slowed down. The reflexes weren't there anymore. Coming back was dangerous. Could damage his legacy, could get him hurt. But Louis needed money. The IRS was relentless, so he came back. September 27th, 1950. Yankee Stadium. Joe Louis versus Ezzard Charles. Charles was the current heavyweight champion, having won the title after Lewis retired. This was Louis trying to reclaim the championship, to prove he still had it, to earn a purse. Lewis lost by unanimous decision. 15 rounds of being outboxed by a younger, fresher fighter. Lewis was still dangerous, still landed good punches, but Charles was better, faster, sharper. The fight wasn't close. Louis took the loss hard, not just because he'd lost, but because it confirmed what he'd feared. He wasn't the fighter he'd been. Age and wear had caught up with him. The comeback was probably a mistake. But the debt was still there, still growing. So Louis kept fighting. Needed to. Had no other way to earn money that could make even a dent in what he owed. Over the next year, Louis fought 8 more times. Won all 8, most by knockout. The opponents weren't top tier. Lewis was being matched carefully, fighting lesser opponents, building back up, trying to earn another title shot. October 26th, 1951, Madison Square Garden, New York. Joe Louis versus Rocky Marciano. This was supposed to be another step in Lewis's comeback. Marciano was young, undefeated, powerful, but Louis was still Joe Louis, the legend, the former champion, the greatest heavyweight of his generation. Marciano was 28 years old, from Brockton, Massachusetts. Rough, crude, not particularly skilled, but relentless, powerful. Refused to stop coming forward, hit like a sledgehammer, destined to become heavyweight champion himself. Lewis was 37 years old, way past his prime, fighting because he needed money, not because he wanted to. His trainers knew it was a mistake. Lewis wasn't fast enough anymore, wasn't sharp enough, was too old to compete with young, hungry fighters. The first 7 rounds were competitive. Lewis boxed well, used his experience, his technique, landed good punches, but Marciano kept coming, never stopped, absorbed punishment, and kept pressing forward. Round 8. Louis was tiring. The body couldn't maintain the pace anymore. Marciano sensed it, pressed harder, threw big punches, backed Louis to the ropes. Then it happened. Marciano landed a left hook, clean, powerful, perfect. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, the man who destroyed Max Schmeling, the greatest heavyweight champion of his era, went down. Louis fell through the ropes, literally fell out of the ring, landed at the feet of the reporters at ringside. The symbolism was devastating. The champion who'd risen so high, who'd achieved so much, was now on the floor outside the ring. The referee counted him out. The fight was over. Rocky Marciano had knocked out Joe Louis. The crowd was silent, shocked. This wasn't supposed to happen. Louis wasn't supposed to go out like this. Legends were supposed to retire on top, to leave as champions, to maintain their dignity. But Louis had been knocked out, badly, humiliatingly, at 37 years old, fighting for money because the government he'd served was crushing him with tax debt. Louis retired immediately after the Marciano fight, this time for good. The comeback was over. The fighting career was finished. At 37 years old, Joe Louis was done as a boxer. His final record was 66 wins, 3 losses, 52 knockouts. The numbers were impressive, legendary. But the ending was sad, tragic. The kind of ending no champion deserves, but many experience. The years after boxing were difficult. Louis tried various ventures, opened businesses that failed, invested in projects that went nowhere. The IRS followed him everywhere, garnished every dollar he earned. He could never escape the debt, never get ahead. He worked as a greeter at casinos in Las Vegas. The Caesars Palace Hotel hired him, paid him to stand in the lobby, to shake hands with guests, to pose for photos, to be Joe Louis. The job was humiliating for a man of Louis's stature, the greatest heavyweight champion of his generation, reduced to being a human attraction. Standing in a casino lobby, smiling for tourists, signing autographs for tips. But Louis needed the money. The IRS took most of it, but at least it was something. At least it was better than nothing. At least it paid some bills. His personal life struggled too. Louis had been married 4 times. The first 3 marriages ended in divorce. The relationships couldn't survive the pressure, the financial stress, the decline, the loss of the life they'd expected. His 4th marriage, to Martha Jefferson in 1959, lasted until his death. Martha stood by him through the worst years, through the decline, through the struggles, through everything. She was the stability he needed when everything else was falling apart. But the mental health issues were getting worse. Louis battled depression, deep, clinical depression that he couldn't shake. The contrast between who he'd been and what he'd become was too much. The greatest heavyweight champion reduced to a casino greeter. The hero who'd unified America, now broke and forgotten. He developed paranoia, believed people were following him, plotting against him. The paranoia wasn't rational, but it felt real to Louis. His mind was betraying him the way his body had betrayed him in the Marciano fight. He used cocaine. Started as a way to cope with the depression and paranoia. Became a habit. Then became a problem. The drug use made everything worse. Made the paranoia more intense. Made the depression deeper. His friends and family tried to help. Got him into treatment. But the problems persisted. The strong, calm, controlled fighter of his youth was gone. Replaced by a man struggling with demons he couldn't knock out. In 1969, Louis suffered a physical collapse, combination of drug use, stress, and accumulated health problems. He was hospitalized. Doctors diagnosed him with cocaine-induced paranoia. The condition was serious, but treatable. Louis spent time in psychiatric facilities, got help, got better gradually. But the physical decline continued. Heart problems developed. The accumulated damage of a lifetime of fighting, of carrying weight, of stress and pressure, and sacrifice. The body was breaking down. By the 1970s, Louis was confined to a wheelchair much of the time. Couldn't walk without assistance. The man who'd been so physically powerful, so athletically gifted, was now struggling with basic mobility. But even in decline, people remembered. Remembered what he'd done, who he'd been, what he'd meant. When Joe Louis entered a room, even in a wheelchair, people stood, applauded, wanted to thank him for the fights, for the victories, for what he'd represented. Younger generations who hadn't seen him fight knew the name, knew the legend, the man who'd beaten Max Schmeling, the man who'd unified America, the greatest heavyweight champion of his era. In 1976, President Gerald Ford awarded Joe Louis the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, recognition for his contributions to America for his service, for what he'd represented. The ceremony was emotional. Louis was 62 years old, in a wheelchair, struggling with health problems. But for a moment, he was honored, recognized, celebrated by his country. The same country whose IRS had crushed him financially was now giving him its highest honor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but Louis accepted the medal gracefully, humbly, following the rules even now, staying dignified despite everything. In 1978, Louis suffered a cardiac arrest, survived but was weakened significantly. The heart problems were getting worse. The body was giving out. Everyone knew the end was coming. The only question was when. April 12th, 1981. Las Vegas, Nevada. Joe Louis died of cardiac arrest. He was 66 years old. The Brown Bomber was gone. The news spread quickly, across America, across the world. The greatest heavyweight champion was dead. The man who'd beaten Hitler's fighter was gone. An era had ended. The funeral for Joe Louis was held at the Max M. Fisher Music Center in Detroit, the city where he'd grown up, where he'd delivered ice, where he'd discovered boxing, where he'd started the journey that would make him a legend. Thousands attended, people who'd known him, people who'd watched him fight, people who'd never met him but felt connected to him, people for whom Joe Louis had represented something larger than boxing, larger than sports, larger than himself. The service was a reflection of Louis' impact. Frank Sinatra sang. Jesse Jackson gave the eulogy. Former heavyweight champions served as pallbearers. This wasn't just a funeral for a boxer. This was a state funeral for an American hero. Jesse Jackson's eulogy captured something essential about Louis's life. He made us all proud. He made America proud. He fought more than one man. He fought for all of us, against fascism, against racism, against the idea that some people matter more than others. And he won, not just in the ring, but in the larger fight for dignity and equality. The words were true, but incomplete. Louis had won many fights, but he'd also lost battles that mattered. The battle against financial ruin, the battle for fair treatment by his own government, the battle for recognition that should have come sooner, the battle for the comfortable retirement he'd earned. President Ronald Reagan issued a statement, said that Joe Louis had been a champion in every sense of the word, had represented American values, had served his country heroically, deserved to be honored as a national hero. Then Reagan did something unprecedented. He waived the requirement that only military officers who died on active duty could be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Louis had been a sergeant. Under normal circumstances, his rank wouldn't qualify him. But Reagan declared that Joe Louis had been a champion of America, had served the nation in ways that transcended rank, deserved to be buried among heroes. On April 21st, 1981, 9 days after his death, Joe Louis was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The casket was draped with an American flag. A military honor guard stood watch. Taps was played. The flag was folded and presented to Martha, his widow. The man who'd been born in a sharecropper's cabin in Alabama, who'd escaped poverty through boxing, who'd unified America by beating a German fighter, who'd served his country selflessly, who'd been crushed by debt and stripped of financial dignity, was finally recognized fully by his country. Too late to help him in life. Too late to forgive the tax debt that had haunted him. Too late to give him the comfortable retirement he'd earned, but meaningful nonetheless. A final recognition that Joe Louis had mattered, that his service and sacrifice and achievements had meant something. Joe Louis's legacy is complicated, multifaceted, more than just boxing achievements, though those were extraordinary. More than just the Schmeling fights, though those were historically significant. The legacy is about what he represented, what he proved, what he made possible. First and most obviously, Joe Louis was one of the greatest heavyweight champions in boxing history. The record speaks for itself. 12 years as champion, 25 title defenses, 66 wins, 52 knockouts, Dominance that hasn't been matched before or since. Boxing historians consistently rank Louis among the top 2 or 3 heavyweights of all time. Some argue he's the greatest ever. The competition he faced was better than almost any other champion. He fought frequently, dominated his era completely. The longevity was unmatched. But the boxing legacy, as impressive as it is, isn't the most important part of Joe Louis's story. The most important part is what he represented, what he proved, what he made possible for others. Joe Louis was the first black athlete to become a true American hero. Not just a hero to black Americans, though he certainly was that, but a hero to all Americans. Someone who transcended race. Someone who belonged to everyone. This was unprecedented. Before Louis, black athletes were confined to black communities. White America might acknowledge their achievements, but wouldn't embrace them. Wouldn't claim them as American heroes. Wouldn't celebrate them the way they celebrated white athletes. Jack Johnson had been heavyweight champion, but white America hated him for it. Hated that he didn't know his place. Hated that he challenged their assumptions. Spent years trying to find a white fighter to beat him. Eventually drove him out of the country. Joe Louis changed that. Not because he was more talented than Johnson, but because he played by rules that made white America comfortable. Because he was humble and respectful. Because he never threatened their prejudices. Because he let them claim him without challenging them. This required compromise. Required Louis to suppress parts of his personality. Required him to follow rules that stripped away individuality and spontaneity. Required him to be less than fully human in public. To be a symbol rather than a person. Some people criticized Louis for this. Said he should have been more like Muhammad Ali would later be. Should have spoken out. Should have challenged the system. Should have used his platform to demand change. The criticism isn't entirely wrong. Louis could have done more. Could have said more. Could have pushed harder for civil rights. But the criticism also doesn't fully account for the time Louis lived in. The constraints he operated under. The consequences he would have faced for stepping out of line. Jack Johnson had challenged the system openly, and the system destroyed him. Louis learned from that, understood that survival required playing by certain rules, that you could challenge racism through excellence while appearing to accept it, that sometimes you had to work within the system to change it. The Schmeling fights were the centerpiece of Louis' legacy, not just because of the boxing, but because of what they represented. In 1936, Schmeling's victory had been used by Nazi propaganda to prove Aryan superiority. The defeat was devastating not just for Louis, but for everyone who believed in equality. But in 1938, Louis got his rematch, and in 124 seconds, he destroyed Schmeling, destroyed the Nazi narrative, proved that racial theories were lies, struck a symbolic blow against fascism before World War II even officially began. The significance of that victory cannot be overstated. It wasn't just a boxing match. It was a statement, a proof, a demonstration that excellence has no color, that courage has no race, that Nazi ideology was built on lies that could be demolished by one black American with 2 fists and 124 seconds. For black Americans in 1938, living under Jim Crow, facing daily discrimination, denied basic rights, Joe Louis's victory represented something essential: hope, pride, proof, validation. The victory showed that given a fair chance, a level playing field, black excellence was undeniable. The psychological impact was profound. Young black Americans who'd been told their entire lives that they were inferior saw Joe Louis stand over Max Schmeling and understood something different. They could be great. They could achieve. They could force America to acknowledge them. Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier in 1947. He said later that Joe Louis made it possible. Without Louis proving that a black champion could be accepted, celebrated, and claimed by all of America, Robinson's path would have been even harder. Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Clay in 1942, grew up idolizing Joe Louis, learned from him, understood what Louis proved, but also understood what Louis couldn't do. Ali would be different, more vocal, more challenging, more willing to risk everything for his principles. But he could be that because Lewis had already proven black excellence was undeniable. Every black athlete who came after Louis walked a path he helped clear. Willie Mays, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Serena Williams. Every single one benefited from what Joe Louis proved in 1938. That black excellence, when undeniable enough, could force America to pay attention. The political impact was significant too. World War II forced America to confront its contradictions, fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home, claiming democracy while enforcing segregation, preaching equality while practicing racism. Joe Louis made those contradictions harder to ignore. If a black man could be America's champion, could represent the nation, could be celebrated by everyone, could strike a symbolic blow against fascism, then why couldn't black Americans vote? Why couldn't they eat at the same restaurants? Why couldn't they attend the same schools? The questions didn't have good answers, and the inability to answer them helped fuel the civil rights movement that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. Louis himself wasn't a civil rights activist, didn't march, didn't protest, didn't make speeches demanding change. That wasn't his style, wasn't permitted by the rules he'd agreed to follow. But his existence, his achievements, his acceptance made the movement possible, showed that change was possible, that black excellence could force white America to reconsider its assumptions. That progress, however slow and incomplete, was achievable. The financial tragedy of Louis's life is part of his legacy too. The fact that he died broke despite earning millions. The fact that the IRS crushed him for donating money to support the war effort. The fact that America celebrated him while his own government destroyed him financially. This reveals something about how America treats its heroes, especially its black heroes. They're celebrated as symbols, used for propaganda, claimed as proof of American values, but not actually taken care of, not actually valued as human beings who deserve dignity and financial security. Joe Louis served his country heroically, donated over $100,000 to military charities, boxed in 96 exhibitions for troops, gave up 4 prime earning years, and the government thanked him by demanding full taxes on money he'd donated, by crushing him with debt, by forcing him to come out of retirement and get knocked out by Rocky Marciano, by reducing him to a casino greeter. The injustice is obvious. The contrast between the rhetoric of heroism and the reality of mistreatment is stark. But it's also typical. America has a history of using black heroes and then abandoning them, of celebrating their achievements while denying them basic dignity and support. This is part of Louis's legacy too. A reminder that symbolic acceptance isn't enough, that being claimed as a hero doesn't mean being treated fairly, that America needs to do better, to actually value the people it celebrates, to back up the rhetoric with support and dignity. The personal cost of being first is part of the story. Louis had to suppress his personality, had to follow rules that made him less than fully human in public, had to be humble when he deserved to celebrate, had to be careful when he should have been free, had to represent everyone when he should have been allowed to just be himself. This is the cost of being a pioneer, of breaking barriers, of being first. You absorb the punishment so others can follow an easier path. You maintain perfection so others can be imperfect. You sacrifice your own humanity so others can be more fully human. Louis paid this cost. Willingly or not, he paid it. And every black athlete who came after him, who was able to be more authentic, more vocal, more challenging, owes him a debt. Today, Joe Louis is remembered primarily for the Schmeling fights, for those 124 seconds in 1938, for making Hitler look away, for proving Nazi racial theories were lies. That memory is accurate and important. Those fights were historically significant, world-changing. But the fuller story matters too. The poverty he escaped, the rules he followed, the compromises he made, the service he gave, the debt he carried, the struggles he faced, The dignity he maintained despite everything. That's the real legacy. Not just athletic achievement, though that was extraordinary, but human achievement. Survival with grace, excellence with humility, service with sacrifice, persistence despite crushing obstacles. Joe Louis showed us what's possible when excellence meets determination, when talent meets discipline, when courage meets persistence. He showed us that one person can change history, can strike a blow against hate, can prove that racial theories are lies, can force America to confront its contradictions. But he also showed us the cost, what you have to sacrifice, what you have to endure, what it takes to be first, the price of being a pioneer, the burden of representation, the weight of carrying an entire race's hopes. In the end, Joe Louis's greatest victory wasn't defeating Max Schmeling, wasn't winning the heavyweight championship, wasn't unifying America. His greatest victory was surviving, maintaining dignity when everything else was stripped away, continuing to represent hope and excellence even when personally struggling, showing that the measure of a person isn't just their triumphs, but how they handle defeat and adversity. Joe Louis changed American history. Not alone, never alone. But he was essential, crucial, the foundation others built on, the proof that excellence transcends race, the example of how one person can matter. The sharecropper's son who became heavyweight champion, the boy who delivered ice who became the man who made Hitler look away, the fighter who followed the rules while quietly changing them, the champion who served his country and was crushed by it, the hero who died, broke but honored. That's Joe Louis. Complicated, human, flawed, heroic, all of it. That's his legacy. And we're still learning from it, still being inspired by it, still understanding what it means to be first, to be excellent, to change history one fight at a time. 124 seconds in 1938 that shattered an empire. 12 years as heavyweight champion that proved excellence has no color. A lifetime of grace under pressure that showed us what's possible. That's what Joe Louis gave us. And that's what we must remember. Not just the victories, but the struggle. Not just the triumphs, but the cost. Not just the legend, but the man. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, the champion who changed America, the hero who survived America, the man who proved that one person, with courage and determination and persistence, can change the world. Even when the world fights back, even when the cost is everything, even when recognition comes too late. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. That's what Joe Louis means. Yesterday, today, forever.